The project we're working on is replacing the radiator and repairing the transmission cooler on a 2001 Dodge Caravan Sport with a 3.3 liter engine. First thing we're going to do is look at the tools that we need. Here's the radiator. You can see this is a brand new radiator. And what had happened with this vehicle is the brackets that hold the transmission cooler in place, the rivets had popped on them. And that ended up causing either the transmission cooler or one of those brackets to actually wear a hole in the radiator. So that's why we're replacing the radiator. This particular radiator I happened to get off Amazon.com. I believe it was around $112, brand new. And the tools that we're going to use today are a rivet gun, and then also some rivets and washers, and these are aluminum, a screwdriver, and here's an example of one of the rivets with the aluminum washer on it, flat blade screwdriver, and then we've got a hose clamp wrench, got an 8mm and a 10mm ratcheting wrench, a pry bar, a 3/8" ratchet with a long extension, 10mm socket, a 13mm socket, a swivel adapter for a 3/8" ratchet, pair of needle nose pliers, Phillips head screwdriver, or a drill with a Phillips head, utility knife, and then an air ratchet is not necessary. It just makes some of the disassembly easier if you choose to go the route of actually removing the front bumper. And a couple of plastic bags. I like to just take the bolts, especially in situations like this where I'm going to be removing a lot of bolts, take them out and label them so I know where they go back to. Some penetrating oil, some dielectric grease, and then also an upper and lower radiator hose. You can see here that I've just got the upper because I've actually already put on the lower. And I'm in the process, I already started this project. So I've actually already started this, and I'm in the process of now putting the new radiator back in. You can see here that I've taken the radiator out. I did not bother to remove the front bumper, and I'm going to try and put this back in. I find that it didn't really give me a whole lot of additional clearance by removing that, so I just left it in. And you can see the repair that I've done on the transmission oil cooler. The rivets that have popped loose, there's a bracket right down in here, I don't know if you can see, that holds via rivet the transmission cooler. And then also we've got these long brackets here, a top and a bottom, and these rivets here had worked their way loose, and so I've replaced those on the top and the bottom, and then also replaced the rivets in this particular bracket, and I've put that all back together. And you can also see down there, there's the new lower radiator hose, so that's already in place. And here's the upper radiator hose that we're going to be replacing. And I figured these hoses aren't leaking, but since I've got everything apart, I'm going to go ahead and replace them. Another thing that's worth inspecting to see if it needs replacement are your actual transmission oil hoses that run from the transmission to the cooler. These are still in good shape, so we're going to go ahead and leave those in place. Now, as far as prep work, in order to get this removed, I've had to take a couple of pieces off. One is the metal bracket here that the hood latch mounts to. I'm going to put this back in place so you can see that basically is held on by 4 bolts, and I need to remove that in order to get the radiator out. You can see these are the bolts. They take a 13mm socket to pull those out. Pretty easy to get out. They shouldn't be rusted or corroded. So pop those 4 bolts out. And some of the manuals say that you have to take this hood latch off. I found that you didn't need to. I just swing this up and then set it against the front driver's side here. So you can see that's how that's sitting. And then the other piece that you have to remove before you take that out is that plastic shroud, whatever you want to call that. That's also held on just by some screws. That's where the cordless drill or a Phillips head screwdriver is going to come in handy. You can see they're just simple screws There's about 6 of them. And then there's a couple of bolts that you have to remove too that I believe are a 10mm head. So once you've got that off, then you've got pretty much all the access you need to pull the radiator out. You can see here's the old radiator. I've just got that laying on the ground. And then the fans, there's 2 bolts that hold the fans in place. And once you undo those 2 bolts up at the top, which bolt in right here to the top of the radiator, then you can just pull those fans up and out. They actually sit in these little clips down here. So those are pretty easy to remove as well. And then there's a electrical connector on each of those fans that you need to remove. And here's what that looks like. And that's where the dielectric grease comes in that we looked at before. It's not absolutely necessary, but if you have it on hand, then it'll just make removing those a little bit easier in the future if you ever need to do it. Okay, first thing we're going to do is go ahead and take this upper hose off just to get this out of the way and get us a little more clearance. So I'm going to use the hose clamp pliers. Squeeze those so I can pull it down. Just makes that job a little bit easier. Sometimes you can pull this off pretty easily, but in this case, since we know we're getting rid of the hose, I'm just going to make this job a little bit easier and just go ahead and cut this with the utility knife. And then flathead screwdriver. Try and pry that up. And once you break that loose, this should come out fairly easily. So now we've got that off. And that's garbage, so we'll go ahead and discard that. So now we're ready to put our radiator back in. One of the trickiest parts to getting this in is the actual clearance. On the driver's side, you're going to see there's a wiring harness down here that makes it rather difficult to get into. You can see I chewed that up a little bit trying to get this out, but this makes the clearance rather tight. So find the best option is to work it in there at an angle and just slowly but surely work it down in there. You can also see we've got these 2 holes here at the bottom of the radiator, and this is what your condenser coil down here slides into. So this lifts up, and then there's 2 posts on the bottom of this that drop down in there, and that's what holds that bottom part into place. One of the things we have to do is on our old radiator, you need to check. One of the things you want to check on your old radiator is make sure there's these little rubber grommets. One of them stayed on that post, and one came off, so you just want to make sure that you get those off. And if it came off, put it back in place on the new radiator. So now it's just a matter of very gingerly getting your radiator into place. And you want to be very careful with your AC lines over on this passenger side that you don't damage those. They have a little bit of play, but not much. Okay, so we've got that in. One of the things you have to feel for is down at the bottom, on the bottom of this radiator. You can see it on the old radiator. You have these 2 posts, the rubber grommets on them. Those sit into 2 holes in the bottom of that radiator support. So you want to make sure that you get those set in there. And now this is where if you wanted to pop this front grille off, you can do that. There's 2 bolts that hold it on. You have to remove the headlights to get to one of them, and then the other one is under the fender well, and then you've got some clips, some plastic body panel clips underneath, maybe a half a dozen that have to be removed. But I'm going to try and do this without taking that off. So when you've got the radiator in place, you now need to lift up this other coil assembly or condenser assembly and drop it into those 2 holes that we looked at earlier, which are these here. So you'll lift those up, set that down in there, and then that'll hold that in place. Okay. Alright, so we've got the radiator in there, and we've also lifted up the condenser here and set this back down into the little alignment holes here. So now we just need to start putting things back together. First thing I'm going to do is go ahead and put in my 2 bolts here that hold these 2 units together. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and put a little anti-seize compound on these nuts, and then we also need to put on the bolts, we need to put these speed nuts back in place. I took these off of the old radiator. The new one, at least this one, didn't come with them already on, so we're just going to slip those back in place, and then take our gooped up bolt and slide that through. There's 2 of these, 1 on each side, that mate these 2 units together. And I'm just going to finger tighten them for now, and then move to the other side. I'll come back and tighten those later. If you break these getting them off, then obviously you'll have to buy new ones. And this is probably the one thing that's a little bit easier if you take this whole front bumper off, but it's not absolutely necessary because you can get a wrench in there pretty easily. Let's of course get that down, and I'm gonna have to move that speed nut down a little bit. It's caught up right now. So I've just used a screwdriver to move that down a little bit. On this fill tube there's some little ribs in here and it was caught up on that, so I just had to pull it out a little bit and then pry it back in. And this is a 10 millimeter. A ratcheting wrench comes in real handy. And with the headlight removed, you can get in there pretty easily. Just gonna snug that down, and then do the other side. But again, so that's done. So now while we've got the fans out, we'll go ahead and get our hoses hooked back up. So we'll go ahead and put the lower radiator hose on. What I'm going to do, just to make this hose slip on a little bit easier, I'm just going to spray some silicone on that outlet there. And then slide that on. And then I'm going to use my hose clamp pliers here to slightly better grip. And make sure I've got that on there all the way as far as it'll go. And then fix that clamp.